He didn't buy her for love, he bought her to survive. The ranch was dying, the debts climbing, and the banks didn't loan to broken men. When they brought her off the wagon, a 39-year-old woman, worn but proud, the rancher expected another mouth to feed, not a reason to keep going. She'd been sold off from the labor camps, eyes tired from years of toil, hands calloused like his own. The townsfolk laughed. "She's too old, Boone," they said. But as the days passed, she worked harder than any hired hand, never asking, never complaining. And one night, when the sky burned red over the prairie, he realized he hadn't bought a woman. He'd found the one thing money couldn't ever buy: hope. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The wagon wheels creaked to a halt at the edge of Boone's land, the last rays of dusk bleeding across the plains like the dying embers of a long fire. The air was sharp with the scent of dust and distance, that lonely quiet that belonged only to places too forgotten for God to bother watching. Boone climbed down first, boots crunching over the brittle grass, his shadow long and tired beside the horse. He'd seen his ranch through storms, droughts, and debts that ate at him like a sickness. But this was a different kind of reckoning. The woman followed him down from the wagon without a sound. Margaret. They'd called her on the bill of sale, though her name felt too soft for a life that had clearly been carved by hard years. Her dress was plain, faded brown like the earth itself, and her hands, he noticed them first, were scarred and strong, the kind that knew labor better than comfort. She looked around the ranch slowly, her eyes sweeping over the sagging barn, the patchy fences, the empty corral that once held life. "You need help," she said finally, her voice low, steady, and unafraid. "I can give it." Boone wanted to scoff, to tell her this place didn't need help, it needed a miracle, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he gave a single nod, rough and wordless, the kind of gesture men used when pride was all they had left. He picked up her small sack of belongings and handed it to her, motioning toward the cabin. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a roof that leaked when it rained, but it had stood through everything else that had broken around it. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of smoke and silence. He set her things down near the hearth, struck a match, and lit the kindling. The flames sputtered to life, throwing gold against the walls, and for the first time, Boone noticed how thin she was, like a shadow barely holding form. "You can take the cot," he said gruffly, pointing toward the corner. "Ain't much, but it's clean." She nodded once, unbothered, then moved toward the small table by the window where a pile of unwashed dishes sat waiting. Without asking, she rolled up her sleeves and began to scrub, her movements efficient and practiced. Boone stood there for a moment, unsure what to make of it. No words, no demands, just quiet work, like she was trying to erase the proof that this house had belonged to despair for too long. Outside, the wind howled low through the gaps in the boards, but inside, something small had shifted. He found himself watching her as the firelight played across her face, lined. Yes, but not worn down. Strong in the way the land was strong, weathered but unyielding. When she finally looked up, catching him staring, he turned away too fast, pretending to busy himself with his tools. "There's stew," he muttered. "What's left of it?" "I'll make more tomorrow," she said simply, and there was no question in her tone, only certainty. He nodded again, slower this time, his chest tight with something he didn't recognize, something halfway between gratitude and shame. When he stepped outside before bed, the night was black and vast, the stars sharp as nails. He looked back through the cabin window, saw her kneeling by the fire, stirring the pot, her profile lit by the soft orange glow. For years, he'd believed the land couldn't be saved, that no seed could take root in soil so dry and bitter. But as he stood there listening to the faint hum of her voice drifting through the wind, a song too quiet to name, Boone realized maybe it wasn't the land that had died first. Maybe it had been him. Before the sun even broke the rim of the earth, Margaret was awake. The cold still clung to the air like frostbite, but she moved through it as if born from it. Her steps quiet but certain, her breath a pale cloud against the dark. Boone heard her long before he saw her, the low creak of the barn door, the soft clatter of a pail, the muffled snort of horses stirred from their sleep. He lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of her labor as dawn crawled in through the cracks in the boards. He'd been up before dawn every day of his life, but somehow she always beat him to it. By the time he stepped outside, she had already stoked the fire, cooked breakfast, and set the day in motion. The smell of coffee mingled with the tang of hay and the soft thud of hooves in the paddock. Boone found her by the corral, sleeves rolled, hands raw from work, tightening the fence posts he'd long given up on fixing. "You don't have to do that," he muttered, but she didn't look up. "Someone does," she said simply, her tone flat, not unkind. He didn't argue. There was no use arguing with a woman who treated hardship the way most folks treated breathing. She moved from one task to the next without pause, feeding the horses, patching the chicken coop, hauling water from the well that sat half a mile down the trail. Boone followed her in silence, pretending to busy himself with his own chores, but his eyes kept finding her, drawn by the strange steadiness she carried. There was no rush in her, no panic, just the slow, relentless patience of someone who'd been shaped by survival. When her hands cracked open from the cold and the rope, she didn't stop. She wrapped them in a strip of cloth torn from her dress and kept working. Boone offered to help once, reaching for the bucket she was carrying, but she shook her head, her gaze fierce beneath the shadow of her hat. "You've got your work," she said. "I've got mine." And she meant it. By the end of the first week, the change was visible. The fences that had been falling for years now stood straight and strong. The barn, once sagging with neglect, smelled of fresh hay and oil, the stalls swept clean. The horses that had gone half wild under his half-care now leaned into her touch, their coats brushed and gleaming. Even the fields seemed to shift, the earth darkening as if readying itself for something new. Boone watched all of it with the wary awe of a man who'd forgotten what progress looked like. At night, when the work was done and the silence returned, he'd sit by the fire, pretending to read old ledgers while she mended shirts or cleaned tools, her needle flashing in the dim light. The rhythm of her presence filled the cabin in ways words couldn't steady, quiet, necessary. He found himself listening for her when she moved into the next room, the scrape of her chair, the faint hum of a tune under her breath. There were moments he wanted to speak, to thank her, to ask why she worked herself so hard, but every time the words rose, pride shoved them back down. So he said nothing. Instead, he began waking earlier, matching her stride, working beside her in the fields as the days grew longer. She never commented on it, but once, as they loaded hay into the wagon, she looked at him, just briefly, and gave a small nod of approval. It wasn't much, but it lit something in him he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, maybe, or the faint stirrings of redemption. By the time the next full moon rose, the ranch had begun to breathe again. The wind still carried the same bite. The land was still hard, but there was life in it now, stubborn, quiet, enduring just like her. Boone lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, and realized that somewhere between the fences and the firelight, the silence he'd once depended on had been replaced by something far more dangerous: hope. The town was buzzing that morning, dust rising from wagon wheels and boots as Boone and Margaret rode in side by side, the creak of the harness the only sound between them. It had been months since Boone had come to town for more than a quick trade, and now with her beside him, the place felt sharper somehow, eyes turning, voices softening only after they'd passed. He felt the weight of it immediately, the kind of silence that ain't silent at all but thick with judgment. The general store's bell jingled when they stepped inside, the smell of tobacco and molasses heavy in the air. Boone went to fetch feed and nails, while Margaret lingered by the shelves, her rough hands brushing over bolts of fabric like they were something foreign. The woman behind the counter, Mrs. Keeley, forced a smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. "Didn't figure you for the domestic sort, Boone," she said lightly. "Or did the lady here talk you into a few comforts?" Boone ignored her, setting down his list, his jaw working as he counted the coins. Outside, two men leaned against a post, watching them through the window. "Boone bought himself a maid," one said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. "Cheaper than a wife, I reckon," the other added with a snort. Laughter followed, low, mean, the kind that clawed under the skin. Boone's hand stilled mid-count, the old heat rising up in his chest, the kind he hadn't felt since before everything went wrong. He turned slightly, catching the reflection of Margaret's face in the glass. Her eyes were lowered, not out of shame, but control her lips pressed tight, her back straight as a fence post. Without a word, she picked up the sack of flour from the counter, paid for it herself, and walked out. Boone followed, his fists clenched, shoulders tight. The men outside tipped their hats mockingly as she passed. "Fine day, ma'am," one said, drawling the word like a joke. Boone stopped in front of him, close enough for their boots to almost touch. For a long second, no one spoke. The wind stirred dust between them. "You don't know a damn thing about her," Boone said finally, his voice low and even, but sharp enough to cut through steel. The man smirked, starting to reply, but Boone's stare shut him up cold. Margaret was already hitching the wagon when Boone joined her. He climbed up without a word, and they rode in silence all the way home. The road stretched endless before them, the sound of the wheels groaning against the dirt. Boone glanced at her once, her hand steady on the reins despite the tremor he could see in her jaw. "They don't know what they're talking about," he muttered. Margaret didn't look at him. For a long moment, he thought she might not answer at all. Then she spoke, her voice calm, quiet, but laced with steel. "Then let's prove them wrong." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than any promise. When they reached the ranch, she climbed down and went straight to work, unloading supplies, feeding the horses, fixing what needed fixing. Boone watched her as the light faded, his anger cooling into something deeper, a kind of resolve he hadn't known he still had. That night, as the fire crackled low, he found her mending a torn shirt by the hearth. The shadows danced across her face, softening the lines carved by years of hard living. He wanted to say something to tell her how proud he was, how much she'd done, but the words didn't come easy to him. So instead, he sat across from her, the silence between them no longer heavy but alive, filled with an understanding that didn't need speaking. Outside, the wind swept across the plains, and Boone thought of the town, the sneers, the laughter, and realized that proving them wrong wasn't just her fight anymore. It was his, too. The first strike came out of nowhere, a blinding flash that split the horizon in two, followed by a thunderclap that shook the rafters. Boone was out of bed before the echo faded, the acrid scent of smoke already threading through the air. He flung open the door and saw it his barn, the heart of the ranch, lit up like Judgment Day. Flames clawed up the dry timber, sparks leaping into the black sky as the wind whipped the fire into a hungry frenzy. He didn't think, didn't shout for help, he just ran. The heat hit him like a wall, thick and alive, roaring in his ears. Inside, the horses screamed, panicked and wild, their eyes rolling white in the flickering light. Boone tore at the gate, the iron latch searing his palm as he shoved it open and slapped the nearest horse on the flank, driving it out into the rainless storm. A beam crashed behind him, scattering embers, the smell of burning hay stinging his throat. Somewhere outside, a voice cried his name, Margaret's voice, but he didn't stop. He made it to the last stall, coughing hard, his vision blurring, when the world gave way above him. The beam came down in a shower of sparks and smoke, pinning him hard against the dirt. He felt the weight crush his ribs, the fire closing in, and for one dizzy, useless moment, he thought maybe this was how it was meant to end, his debts paid, his work undone. But then she was there. He didn't see her come in, didn't hear her over the roar, but suddenly her hands were on him, strong, desperate, pulling at the beam with a strength born of something deeper than fear. "Boone!" she shouted, her voice hoarse and breaking. He tried to tell her to leave, to save herself, but no sound came out. She dug her boots into the ground, dragging at the timber, coughing through the smoke. The flames caught her sleeve, and she beat it out with her bare hand, skin blistering under the heat, but she didn't stop. When the beam finally shifted, she pulled him free, half dragging, half carrying him through the collapsing doorway just as the roof caved in behind them. They hit the mud hard outside, the wind whipping sparks across their backs as the barn groaned and fell into itself. Rain came at last, sparse and cold, hissing against the embers. Boone blinked against the sting of smoke, coughing weakly as he felt her arms around him, trembling but unyielding. Then darkness took him. When he woke, it was to the soft crackle of a fire, the smell of salve and smoke thick in the cabin air. His chest ached, his ribs bound tight, and through the haze, he saw her Margaret sitting beside the bed, her hair loose, her arms swathed in linen. Her hands were red and swollen, but she didn't seem to notice. She was staring at him like she'd been doing it for hours. "Don't you dare die," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in it. "You're not done yet." Boone tried to speak, but his throat was dry, the words rasping out like gravel. She leaned forward, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't just strength or defiance, it was fear, raw and human. He wanted to tell her she'd saved him, that she'd done what no one else ever had, but his voice failed again, so he just nodded weakly, and she smiled, small, tired, but real. Outside, the rain had begun to fall steady now, washing the smoke from the air, and through the open window, the faint scent of wet earth drifted in. The barn was gone, the losses would be heavy, but Boone knew the fire hadn't taken everything. As he watched her sitting there, her burned hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on him like an anchor against the storm, he understood that what they'd built together, the work, the trust, the fragile bond growing in the ashes, was something fire couldn't touch. The morning the letter came, Boone already knew before he opened it. The envelope sat heavy in his hand, stamped with the mark of the Redstone Bank, the paper inside crisp and cruel. He read it once, then again, the words blurring but sinking deep all the same. Final notice. Pay in full by month's end or surrender the deed. No extensions, no mercy. The room felt smaller as he folded the paper neatly and set it down on the table beside his half-empty coffee cup. Outside, the land stretched wide and indifferent, sun baking what little green had managed to claw through the drought. The ranch looked alive again thanks to her. Margaret's hands had brought breath back into its bones, but to the bank, it was still just numbers and debt. Boone rose stiffly, still nursing the ache from the fire, and began saddling his last horse, a deep-chested bay named Bristle, the one thing he'd sworn never to sell. But pride, he told himself, didn't feed a man. It sure didn't pay bills. The sound of the cinch tightening must have drawn her out. He heard the door creak open and her voice calm, steady, but carrying that edge that could stop a storm. "Where are you going?" she asked. He didn't answer, just adjusted the strap, keeping his eyes on the ground. "You're gonna sell him," she said flatly, stepping closer. Boone finally looked up. "Ain't got much choice," he muttered. "Bank's calling in the note. Ranch won't hold another season." Her jaw tightened. "So you'll sell the only thing left of who you are?" He almost laughed, bitter and tired. "You think I give a damn about pride? This land's all I've got. Then don't trade your soul to keep it." Her words hit harder than he'd expected, sharp and clean like the crack of a whip. She moved closer, the morning wind tugging at her hair, her burned hands trembling slightly as she set them on the saddle horn between them. "You built this place once," she said. "You can do it, and again. But not if you sell the last piece of yourself to men who never cared if you lived or died." He wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand what it meant to lose everything, but the look in her eyes stopped him cold. She did understand better than anyone. She'd already lost it all once and clawed her way back without breaking. Boone's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. "You got a plan, then?" he asked quietly. "We'll find one," she said, her voice soft but sure. "We always do." The certainty in her tone struck something deep inside him, something buried under years of loss and silence. It wasn't just stubbornness. It was belief in him, in this place, in a future he'd stopped daring to picture. She stepped back, watching him a long moment before adding, "You taught me to hold the line, Boone. Now I'm asking you to do the same." He stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Slowly, he unbuckled the saddle, letting it slide to the dirt with a heavy thud. For the first time in weeks, he looked at the horizon and didn't just see ruin. He saw the same thing she did, possibility. As he led Bristle back into the corral, the sky began to shift, clouds breaking apart to reveal a sliver of blue. The wind carried the smell of rain that wasn't there yet, but promised to come. Boone turned back toward her, his voice rough but steady. "Guess we'll find another way, then." Margaret smiled faintly, that rare, quiet smile of hers that always seemed to cut through the dust. "That's the man I knew was still in there," she said, and walked past him toward the house, her shadow long and sure in the rising light. Boone watched her go, the paper from the bank fluttering in the dirt behind him. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a man waiting to lose everything. He felt like a man ready to fight for it again. The decision came at dawn. Over a pot of coffee gone cold, and the thin whisper of wind against the shutters. Margaret stood by the window, staring out at the brittle earth that stretched for miles, dry and cracked, but waiting, always waiting for a chance to come alive again. "Barley," she said finally, the words soft but certain, like it had been turning over in her mind all night. Boone looked up from the table, brow furrowed. "Barley won't take to this land," he said. "It's too dry, too stubborn." "So are we," she replied, turning toward him with that look, the one that could bend iron if it needed to. He wanted to argue, to list all the reasons it couldn't work, but something in her eyes stopped him. They were clear and fierce, full of the kind of faith he hadn't seen in years. "If it rains," she continued, "it could save the ranch. If it doesn't, well, we're already halfway to losing it anyway." Boone leaned back, arms crossed, weighing the gamble. The idea was madness, a full planting, every acre, everything they had left sunk into one desperate throw against the sky. But she was right. Doing nothing would finish them just the same. Finally, he nodded once. "Then barley it is." What followed were weeks of blistering days that blurred into one long ache of labor. They plowed from sunrise till the stars came out, sweat soaking through their shirts, hands blistered raw. The soil fought them at every turn, hard as stone at first, but little by little, it yielded. Boone guided the plow, muscles straining, and Margaret walked beside, scattering seed in slow, even arcs, her steps steady, her breath quiet. They worked like two halves of the same motion, one cutting, one sowing, both relentless. The sun burned their necks, the wind scoured their faces, but neither complained. Sometimes, when the exhaustion hit hardest, Boone would glance over and see her standing tall, eyes narrowed against the light, and feel something stir deep in his chest, something dangerously close to hope. At night, they'd sit outside the cabin on the worn porch, too tired to speak, the air humming with crickets and the faint scent of turned earth. The sky stretched wide and merciless above them, stars sharp as glass, and he'd find himself stealing glances at her profile in the firelight. The lines of her face, once hard with fatigue, had softened in the glow, though the strength in them remained. She caught him looking once and raised an eyebrow, half amused. He looked away quickly, pretending to stoke the fire. She didn't tease him for it, only smiled faintly and handed him a tin cup of coffee. "We'll make it," she said quietly, as if speaking to the night itself. "I can feel it." He wanted to believe her, and against all reason, he did. As the days bled together, the land began to change. The soil darkened where they'd turned it, the rows stretching neat and straight like the ribs of a new beast taking shape. Boone could almost see it, the green to come, the life waiting beneath the dirt. He'd catch Margaret humming sometimes as she worked, low and tuneless, and it filled the silence better than any words could. Their shoulders brushed when they passed, their hands met over tools and harness straps, and though neither spoke of it, something unspoken grew between them, steady, patient, like the seeds they'd sown. One evening, when the last field was finally planted, Boone stood at the edge of the land, looking out over what they'd built together. The wind moved across the furrows, carrying the scent of earth and sweat and promise. Margaret came to stand beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth through the cooling air. "Now we wait," she said simply. Boone nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon where storm clouds brewed faint and distant, their edges silver with coming rain. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the weight on his chest eased. Hope, fragile and fierce, rooted itself in him like the first green shoot pushing through hard ground. And as he glanced at her strong, unflinching, the firelight catching in her eyes, he thought maybe, just maybe, this gamble wasn't about the harvest at all. It was about finding something worth fighting for again. The days stretched long and cruel beneath a pitiless sun, each one hotter and drier than the last. The wind carried dust instead of scent, and the fields they'd planted with such fierce hope began to crack open like old wounds. Boone walked the rows each morning, boots kicking up powder where green should have been, his eyes fixed on the horizon as though he could will the clouds into being. The barley shoots had fought bravely, thin blades of life trembling in the heat, but one by one, they curled and withered beneath the unrelenting sky. Every evening, Margaret would bring him water, her hands rough, her face pale with exhaustion, but her voice calm, steady as the ticking of a clock. "It'll come," she'd say. The rain always comes, sooner or later. Boone wanted to believe her, but belief felt like another man's privilege. He'd buried too many dreams beneath this soil to think hope could last without proof. Still, when she looked at him, those gray eyes bright even under the dust and heat, something inside him refused to quit. They kept working even when there was nothing left to do, patching fences, hauling water from the well to the nearest rose, trying to coax life from dying roots. The sun blistered their skin and burned the breath from their lungs, and the nights brought no cool, only the restless hum of crickets and the sound of the earth itself thirsting. One afternoon, Boone found her on her knees in the field, palms pressed against the cracked ground, lips moving soundlessly. For a long moment, he stood there watching her, the sight of her small and unbending against the vast, empty sky hitting him harder than the heat ever could. He didn't believe in much anymore, least of all in prayers, but seeing her there made something shift deep within him, an ache that wasn't despair this time, but longing. When she finally rose, her dress streaked with dirt, she turned toward him and smiled faintly. "It's in God's hands now," she said. Boone wanted to tell her that God had long forgotten this land, that they were on their own out here, but he couldn't. Because when she said it, there was no desperation in her voice, only conviction. That night, the world went still. The wind died. The crickets fell silent. And the air grew heavy with something Boone hadn't felt in months. A waiting, electric and alive. He and Margaret sat outside the cabin, the lantern between them flickering low, their faces lit by the faint, eerie glow of heat lightning dancing on the horizon. "You feel that?" she asked softly. He nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was the storm or the thrum of something deeper, the quiet, invisible tether that had formed between them, strong as the land itself. The first roll of thunder came low and distant, like the growl of an old god stirring awake. Boone lifted his gaze to the sky, and for the first time in weeks, saw the dark swell of clouds gathering, thick and sure. They didn't speak. They just sat there, side by side, watching the heavens build. When the rain finally came, it came all at once, a roar that drowned out everything else. The air turned sweet, the dirt turning to mud underfoot as the heavens opened wide and poured. Margaret stepped out into it, tilting her face upward, her hair plastered to her cheeks, laughter spilling out of her throat like something holy. Boone stood frozen a moment longer, then followed her into the downpour. The rain stung his skin, cold and sharp, and he let it wash over him, over everything, the pain, the doubt, the long years of silence. He looked at her through the curtain of rain, her arms raised to the sky, her eyes closed, and he swore the land itself breathed again. The fields would live, the ranch would stand, and for the first time since the fire, since the debts, since the long years of loneliness, Boone felt something he hadn't dared to feel in far too long. He felt saved. By the time summer turned to gold, the Rawlins land looked like something out of a dream. The barley stretched for miles, thick and high, shimmering beneath the sun like a rolling sea of light. Each stalk bent heavy with promise, whispering in the wind like an answered prayer. Boone had seen good years before, back when life still had color and his hands weren't so tired, but nothing like this, not after so much loss, not after standing at the edge of ruin. The storm that had broken the drought had also broken something inside him, something old, brittle, and afraid, and what grew in its place wasn't just a crop, but faith, reborn and fierce. When the last bundle was tied and the wagons loaded, he and Margaret set out for town, side by side as they always were, the wagon creaking under the weight of the season's work and redemption. Boone wore his hat low, his jaw set with quiet pride, but it was Margaret who drew the town's gaze. She sat tall on the seat beside him, sun catching the faint silver in her hair, her eyes clear and steady, her calloused hands resting easy in her lap. The same people who'd once sneered now paused mid-step, their laughter dying in their throats. The general store's bell chimed as they pulled up, and the world seemed to tilt in their favor for the first time. Boone climbed down, boots hitting the dirt with the heavy certainty of a man who'd earned every breath he took. He reached into his coat, pulled out the thick envelope he'd guarded like a lifeline, and walked into the bank without looking back. Inside, the air smelled of ink and paper and the faint sourness of surprise. Mr. Halpern, the banker, blinked at him from behind his spectacles. "Back again, Mr. Boone?" he asked, voice slick with the same pity he'd used months ago. Boone said nothing, just set the envelope on the counter. The sound it made when it hit the wood was final, undeniable. "Paid in full," Boone said simply. Halpern's mouth twitched, but he nodded, rifling through the bills like a man checking to make sure a miracle was real. When it was done, Boone signed the papers, his hand steady, and walked out into the sunlight where Margaret waited. The townsfolk had gathered now, pretending not to watch, their whispers drifting like wind through tall grass. "Didn't think she had it in her," one man muttered, tipping his hat toward Margaret. Boone stopped mid-step, turned to face him, his eyes calm but sharp. "She had enough for both of us," he said, his voice carrying through the hush that followed. The man dropped his gaze. Margaret looked up at Boone then, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles, one that spoke of satisfaction, of quiet victory, of years of struggle finally met with peace. They climbed back onto the wagon, the reins creaking in Boone's hands as they started down the main road. People moved aside to let them pass. "Mrs. Keeley from the store waved awkwardly, and the blacksmith gave a nod, his eyes softer than before. Even the preacher, standing on the chapel steps, tipped his hat in silent acknowledgement. Boone didn't gloat, didn't even glance their way. He just steered the wagon steady, the clatter of hooves on packed dirt like the heartbeat of something new being born. Margaret leaned slightly toward him, her voice low, carrying under the sound of the wheels. "Feels different now," she said, like the world seeing straight for once. Boone smiled beneath his hat. "Maybe it's us that's changed," he said. She nodded, her gaze turning back to the open road. The sun dipped low as they left the town behind, its light spilling across the barley fields that waited like a golden sea. Boone reached over, resting his hand lightly atop hers on the reins, and she didn't pull away. For once, the land was quiet, not empty, not harsh, just content. The world that had once laughed at them now stood silent, humbled before the proof that strength wasn't always loud or young or proud. Sometimes it was a tired man and a scarred woman, riding home together beneath a sky finally kind enough to bless them both. The first frost had crept over the valley by the time Boone noticed something was wrong. The air had that brittle stillness before winter truly set in. The fields stripped bare and quiet, the barn filled with the smell of hay and smoke and memory. He'd gone out early to mend the trough, his breath white in the cold, and when he came back, the cabin door was half open, a faint draft whispering through it. Inside, Margaret was folding her few belongings into a worn carpet bag, the same one she'd carried off the wagon the day she'd arrived. Her coat lay across the chair, her scarf tucked beneath it, and there was a finality in her movements that stopped him cold. For a long moment, Boone just stood there in the doorway, the world narrowing to the sound of her quiet, deliberate packing. "What are you doing?" he asked finally, his voice low, careful, like he was afraid of the answer. She didn't look up, just kept folding. "You bought me to work," she said evenly, though her hands trembled slightly on the fabric. "And I've done that. The fences are sound, the stock's healthy, the fields are paid for. You don't need me now." Boone's chest tightened as the words settled between them, sharp and wrong. "Ain't never said I didn't need you," he murmured, stepping further inside. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots, loud in the stillness. She stilled, her back to him, and for a moment, neither spoke. The fire in the hearth crackled low, the only sound in a room that suddenly felt too small for all that hung between them. "Margaret," he said, softer now, his voice rough with something unsteady. "Look at me." Slowly, she turned, and he saw the shimmer in her eyes, tears she refused to let fall, the same stubborn pride that had carried her through storms and fire and scorn. "You gave me back this place," he said, taking another step closer, his hands flexing uselessly at his sides. "Hell, you gave me back myself. I didn't know I was buying the only thing I ever needed." The words came out raw, stripped bare of the armor he'd worn his whole life. She froze, the breath catching in her throat, her bag slipping from her fingers to the floor with a soft thud. The silence stretched, heavy and fragile. Boone stood there, heart hammering, watching the war play across her face, the fear, the disbelief, the aching want. "Don't," she whispered finally, shaking her head as though trying to steady herself. "Don't say that unless you mean it." He took another step, close enough now that he could see the faint scar along her temple, the way her breath trembled in the cold. "I ain't said a thing I don't mean," he said simply, and something in his tone, steady, unflinching, broke whatever walls she had left. Her eyes filled, glistening in the firelight, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, her composure slipping at last. "Then don't let me go," she whispered, her voice small and cracked, the plea buried inside it breaking through him like thunder. Boone reached out, slow but sure, his calloused hand finding hers, fingers closing gently over the rough bandages she still wore from the fire months before. He could feel her pulse beneath his thumb, fast and fragile, and it felt like the first real thing he'd held in years. She didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped forward, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of soap and smoke that clung to her. For a long time they just stood there, the fire painting gold across the walls, the wind whispering outside, the whole world holding its breath. Boone lifted her hand to his chest, pressing it over his heart. "Ain't letting you go," he said quietly. "Not now. Not ever." Her tears finally fell then, slow and silent, tracing down her cheeks as she leaned her forehead against his. The years, the pain, the long silence that had filled both their lives had all cracked open in that moment, replaced by something warm, something fierce, something that didn't ask permission to exist. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and slow, blanketing the earth in white. Inside, by the glow of the fire, two souls that had been bought and broken found something no money or drought or fire could ever touch, a home in each other. Spring came soft that year, the kind that didn't rush in with thunder or flood but crept slow and gentle across the valley, breathing life back into the world one green blade at a time. The air smelled of wet soil and wildflowers, and the Boone Ranch, once a place of silence and ghosts, now hummed with the sounds of living. Horses snorting in the corral, the clatter of tools against wood, laughter spilling from the porch where Margaret hummed as she worked. The frost had melted from both the land and the man who'd once called it home. Boone rose before dawn each day, but now he wasn't alone. He'd wake to the warmth of her beside him, the soft rustle of her hair against his shoulder, the quiet peace that came from knowing the day ahead was theirs to share. Together they walked the fields, planting side by side, their hands sinking into the same soil that had once broken them. There was a rhythm to their work now, an unspoken language built through shared labor, and the kind of trust that only grew from surviving the worst the world could offer. Boone guided the plow while Margaret scattered seed in even, sure arcs, her skirts brushing the earth, her face lit by the rising Sunday. Sometimes, when the wind caught just right, he'd glance over and catch her smiling, real, unguarded, the kind of smile that made a man forget he'd ever known despair. And he'd find himself smiling back, though he never said a word. Words weren't needed between them anymore. The land spoke for them both. The ranch itself seemed to reflect their bond-sturdy fences, full barns, fields thick with promise. The animals thrived, the wells ran clear, and laughter had become as common as the wind. When travelers rode past, they'd slow their horses, taking in the sight of the once-dying spread turned to gold under the Sunday. Boone got lucky, they'd say. Storms turned, crops took root, debts paid off. But those who knew better, those who'd watched the way he looked at her, the way she steadied him with a glance, knew luck had nothing to do with it. It was sweat and grit and two stubborn hearts that refused to quit. It was love, quiet and patient, forged in fire and drought and dust. At night, when the work was done, Boone and Margaret would sit on the porch, shoulders touching, watching the horizon burn orange and pink. Sometimes she'd rest her head against his arm, and he'd place his hand over hers, rough against rough, a perfect fit. The years had carved their lines deep, but neither would trade them for youth. Those lines told their story, proof of everything they'd lost, and everything they'd found again. Boone would listen to the hum of crickets and the soft creak of the porch boards and think how strange it was that a man could spend half his life empty and not even realize it until someone came along and filled it without trying. He'd look at her, her face half lit by the fading sun, and feel that same quiet awe he'd felt the first time he saw her stand in the rain, hammering her will into the world. "We done good, Maggie," he'd say sometimes, his voice low, roughened by years and love. She'd smile, eyes soft and knowing. "We sure did, Boone." And as the last light slipped beyond the hills, he'd realize the truth that no preacher or banker could teach. A ranch could fall, a crop could fail, but love built honest, love worked for, could outlast it all. The Boone place became more than land, more than a ranch. It was a living thing, fed by faith, sweat, and the stubborn hearts of two people who refused to give up. And when folks passed by in later years, hearing laughter carry on the wind, they'd tip their hats and say the same thing every time, that the Boone place wasn't built on luck or money, but on something stronger, rarer, and harder won. It was built on love earned the hard way, one sunrise at a time.